Hurricanes are powerful things. In fact, the word hurricane is derived from a Central American indigenous people's name for the god of evil. Writing in a 2013 edition of the journal Chemical Education, Professor Earl Pearson of Middle Tennessee State University used some fancy math to determine that 2008's Hurricane Ike released some 2.6 million times as much energy as the atomic bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. The numbers are hard to figure, but the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration estimates that between 1/3 and 1/2 million people died in Atlantic hurricanes between 1492 and 1994, and more than 1,000 of those died the night of July 31st, 1715, in a disaster that's more remembered for the treasure than for those people. But those people deserve to be remembered.
Spanish treasure fleets sailed from the mid-16th century until nearly the end of the 18th century, carrying the wealth of Spain's New World possessions to the mother country. The system was developed after French corsairs sacked Havana in 1555 and was designed to protect the goods that the Spanish Empire had acquired in its New World colonies from attacks by pirates, privateers, and foreign navies. The system is generally considered to be the first permanent transatlantic trade route in history, and the iconic Spanish galleon was designed to protect these fleets. The amount of treasure that the Spanish Empire plundered from the New World is staggering. Writer Robert Forrest Burgess wrote in his 1975 work Florida's Golden Galleons, Spain's economy was almost totally dependent on these treasure shipments from the New World. Since she manufactured nothing that was needed by other countries, the wealth she received from her New World colonies merely passed through her economy into the economies of other European nations that sold their goods to Spain to fulfill her needs. Thus, this treasure affected the entire European economy. Burgess continues, nearly 95% of the precious metals backing European monetary systems came from the Spanish treasure fleets. The education site Schmoop notes that so much gold and silver was imported by the Spanish that between the years 1500 and 1660, prices in Europe rose 500%. The system, called the Flota de Indias, or West Indian Treasure Fleet, actually usually consisted of 2 fleets that would be sent from Spain each year. The Flota de Indias would collect the treasure derived from the Viceroyalty of Nueva España, or Mexico, and the Tierra Firma Armada, meaning roughly armed earth and called the Galleanos, would collect treasure gathered from Peru. Each fleet would usually be accompanied by 2 warships. The largest flagship was called the Capitana and would be commanded by a general, supported by the second, usually smaller warship, the Almiranta, commanded by an admiral. The fleet would also include smaller patrol vessels, a support ship, and accompanying merchant vessels. The 2 fleets would leave the ports of Cadiz or Seville, carrying European trade goods for which there were demands in New Spain. Burgess writes, the goods going to the New World were consignments of wine, brandy, olive oil, cloth, ironwork, books, 2 years' supply of officially letter-headed legal paper, and the royal monopoly of 3,999.5 hundredweight of mercury to be used in the amalgam process for refining gold. The fleets would go south to the Spanish Canary Islands to resupply, and then using the trade winds in the north equatorial current, head west to the West Indies. The flota would then head to the port of Vera Cruz, and the galleones would head south to Cartagena. The flota would not only collect treasure from New Spain, but also treasure from the Orient, collected in the Spanish East Indies and carried across the Pacific by the Manila Galleon, the world's first regular trans-Pacific trade route, to New Spain. The goods would then be carried by mule train from the west coast to the east. The galleones would collect the vast amounts of silver accumulated in the Potosí mines in Colombia, as well as silver from Peru and pearls collected around the island of Margarita. The flota would winter in Vera Cruz, while the galleones would usually winter in Cartagena. In spring, they would meet in Havana to escort the treasure back to Spain. The 4 warships, 2 capitans, and 2 almirantes carried as many as 200 guns, enough to protect the fleet from pirates and foreign enemies. The combined fleets would leave in spring and sail north, skirting the coast of Florida until they could catch the Gulf Stream north and east of Bermuda and go back east to Spain. The system was effective, but certainly not universally so. Burgess writes, but frequently the fleets failed to reach their destination. The ultimate success or failure of these long voyages depended on the weather. Hurricanes were the worst villains. Throughout the Indies, they destroyed more ships, claimed more lives, and were responsible for the loss of more treasure than all of the pirates or privateers that sailed the 7 seas. Between 1525 and 1825, dozens of Spanish treasure ships were lost in the Florida waters alone. Such was the importance of Spanish gold to the continent that Burgess notes, when one of these fleets was lost, the whole European economic structure felt the effect. For 150 years, the system brought the treasure that funded the crown and the Holy Roman Empire, funding wars across the continent. But over time, the value of the treasure collected and the power of the empire declined. Writing in a 1976 edition of the journal The Americas, Lowell Newton of the University of Louisville writes that, once the greatest maritime power in Western Europe, the Spanish Navy, by the end of the 17th century, was a pallid relic of its former self, while the once immense convoy system that had linked the metropolis with the American colonies was badly decayed. The 1715 treasure fleet was uniquely important. The War of Spanish Succession, considered by some historians to be the first real world war between 1701 and 1714, had interrupted the treasure fleets, while at the same time draining Spanish coffers. The maritime history website Maritime Cyprus wrote in 2012, with the end of the War of Spanish Succession in 1714, the Spanish crown was in desperate need of funds. No major shipment of goods from Spain's New World colonies had been undertaken during the war, so a fleet of galleons was organized to visit various ports of call around the Spanish Main to gather both royal and private treasure to be shipped to Cadiz. Since the majority of the goods consisted of silver coins and bullion, the venture was dubbed the Spanish Plata, meaning silver, fleet. Galleon was by this time merely a term of tradition. The top-heavy Spanish galleon, once the height of naval technology, was well outdated. In fact, the capitana of the flota, the Nuestra Senora del Carmen y San Antonio, or Our Lady of Mount Carmel and St. Anthony, had originally been built in England as the 70-gun third-rate ship of the line, HMS Hampton Court. The ship had been captured by the French in 1707 and sold to the Spanish in 1712. The 1715 treasure fleet had actually started all the way back in 1712. At the time peace negotiations were underway, and a seasoned commander, General Juan Esteban de Ubilla, was placed in charge of the Flota de Indias, with plans to leave for the New World in April. But the enemy threat didn't go away, so the fleet did not sail until an armistice was agreed upon between Spain, Great Britain, and France in September. Ubilla reached Veracruz in December. There, Burgess explains, a series of unfortunate events at Veracruz prevented the fleet's leaving for 2 years and 5 months. The events included damage from weather, but also difficulty selling the goods brought from Spain and getting all the treasure to the correct place after so many years. Another delay came because the King of Spain, Philip V's wife, had died, and he decided to remarry. His 22-year-old prospective bride, Elizabeth of Parma, had demanded that she be provided rare jewels for her wedding, and the king had sent orders to collect the most unique items from the New World, which took time to collect. The numismatist magazine Coin Week explained in 2022, more than 1,200 pieces of rare jewelry from the Americas were being sent to Spain as dowry pieces for Elizabeth. Her request included a heart made of 130 pearls, 14-karat pearl earrings, a pure coral rosary with large-sized beads, and an emerald ring weighing 74 carats. Meanwhile, the Galleones, under the command of General Juan Antonio de Echeverres, had left in July 1713, a year after the flota. They arrived in Cartagena, New Granada, at the end of August, and then went to the Panamanian port of Portobelo in November to collect the treasure from the Viceroyalty of Peru. The Galleones wintered in Portobelo, returned to Cartagena in the spring, and then arrived loaded with treasure in Havana in October. The Cuban port was large and well defended, considered the best place to winter the fleet, which would join with Ubilla in the spring to return to Spain. But Ubilla faced more delays. The fleet was still loading in March when Veracruz was hit by a strong storm, damaging several ships and requiring time for more repairs. Then the fleet struggled with headwinds, and the flagship unexpectedly lost a mast, making the trip to Havana slow, not arriving until June. Newton writes it was impossible for Ubilla or the viceroy to anticipate the dismasting of the flagship, the headwinds that slowed the voyage to Havana, and the subsequent delay in that port while repairs were made to Ubilla's ships. The combined fleet would not be sailing until midsummer. That was a risk. The more they delayed, the more risk that the fleet would run into a hurricane.
Ubilla wrote the viceroy that the fleet planned to leave on July 23rd, but for reasons that are not clear, the fleet didn't leave until a day later, on July 24th.
The combined fleet included 12 vessels, 5 ships of the flota under the command of General Ubilla, and 6 vessels of the Galleones fleet under the command of Echeverres. The last vessel was a coincidence. The French warship Le Griffin, under the command of Captain Antonio Dari, had acquired a license to trade, but when the viceroy had originally set the date of departure in March, by law the ports were closed to foreign vessels to leave. This was to prevent a foreign ship from reporting the fleet's departure date. Dari had little choice. He could go with the fleet or leave after them. He chose to accompany the fleet. The fleet was loaded with an enormous amount of treasure, an estimated 14 million pesos worth, but also with people. Some 2,500 crowded the ships. Burgess gives an example of the crowding. On General Echever's Capitana, the largest ship in the fleet, the gun deck was 160 feet long and less than 40 feet wide. More than 450 persons were relegated to this cramped, dark, damp space. The fleet did not take the shortest route to Florida, instead sticking to the coast, safest in a time when navigation was still uncertain. Burgess writes, if either commander had any foreboding of doom in those final days of July as the fleet pushed on through the treacherous Florida Straits under threatening skies, he undoubtedly kept his fears to himself. But the prelude was over. It was the beginning of the end. The maritime salvage site Mel Fisher's Treasures writes, by noon on July 29th, the fleet was almost becalmed. The sea was running heavy and strangely silent swell, but there was no wind. The clouds were the merest wisp of cirrus way down on the starboard beam, and even the seabirds, which usually swarmed around the ships a mere 20 miles from the shore, had vanished.
By then it was already clear that a storm was coming, but there was little that Ubia could do.
The U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Hurricane Research Division writes, Ubia found himself trapped between the uninhabited, reef-strewn Florida shore to the west and the shallow English pirate-strewn Bahama bank to his east, and had no choice but to try to clear the channel before the worst of the storm struck. It was a race he lost, and the hurricane overtook the fleet just as it emerged from the channel. The fleet started feeling the storm on the 28th. Burgess writes, gradually the wind picked up out of the northeast. The ships leaned into the steepening waves, but their northward movement was slow and awkward. The following day, the fleet was pounded by gales. Burgess continues, with the storm's first powerful blast, the ship staggered and heeled over sharply. Sheets of spray blanketed the bows, spurted from around the closed gun ports, hawse holes and scuppers to race wildly across the decks. The ships no longer obeyed their helms, but were forced around in the wind. And finally, he writes, at 2 a.m. Wednesday, July 31st, the hurricane struck with all its fury, roaring out of the east with winds in excess of 75 miles per hour. Nothing withstood its wrath. Fisher writes, by nightfall, the wind, not the captain's, was in full command. It was gusting now to over 100 knots. Ubia lost his mizzenmast, and the fleet was wildly scattered, and the noise was deafening, but above the screaming winds was another more awesome and frightening sound. The breakers on the reefs which lined the Florida coast. On all the Spanish ships' men prayed as they wrestled to try to cut lifeboats free from the debris littering the decks. All were now resigned to shipwreck, and the priests piping Hail Marys made little or no impression on either their flocks or the elements. Ubia's flagship was among the first to be destroyed. Fisher continues, dismasted, her rudder carried away, she could make not even the vestige of a fight. She struck at 2:30 on the morning of July 31st. The reef ripped the bottom right out of her. Then her superstructure parted from her hull, and the poop and afterdeck were cast up on a 50-foot wave. She was tossed around for a few seconds, just long enough for Ubia and 223 of his crew to be washed off and pounded to death on the rocks. Burgess said of the ship, the 471-ton vessel struck bottom with such force that her entire lower hull was sheared away. Ballast, cargo, cannon, passengers, and 120 tons of registered silver coins and boxes plummeted to the bottom of the rampaging sea. With the ship went the jewels for the Queen's dowry, stored in Ubia's own cabin. She would never see them. One by one, the ships were dashed upon the rocks. A survivor reported, the seas became very giant in size. The wind continued blowing us toward shore, pushing us into shallow water. It soon happened that we were unable to use any sail at all, and we were at the mercy of the wind and water, always driven closer to shore. Having then lost all our masts, all the ships were wrecked on the shore. Fisher writes, the storeships were all caught on the rocks. Echever's war galleon broke up, drowning him and 124 of his crew. His son, who commanded his storeship, met a similar fate. The lighter ships capsized and sank in the surf. Burgess concludes, in a few short hours, the hurricane took a terrible toll on the Spanish treasure fleet of 1715. The wrecks spread across some 40 miles of beach. Newton notes the nature of the tragedy. The hurricane of late July was unusually early, a fact that underscores the irony of the flota's destruction. If the fleet had left Havana on the 23rd of July, as Ubia had said it would, instead of the following day, or for that matter, if it had sailed from Veracruz a few days earlier, the disaster probably would have been avoided. Still, he writes, the reaction of the survivors might surprise people today. Writing to Viceroy Lancaster from Havana on October 15th, one survivor attributed the loss to being God's punishment for our sins. An unidentified official wrote the Bishop of Havana that, in his opinion, these things are alone contingent upon the will of God. Another survivor, Admiral Francisco Salmon, informed Lancaster that these accidents rest upon the will of God. It seems odd that they didn't blame Ubia or the leadership whose actions had delayed the voyage. Newton writes, "These mariners knew they had no control over the weather, and what they could not control or foresee belonged quite naturally to God's providence."
Of the 12 ships of the fleet, 11 were lost. But Dari had outpaced the heavily laden treasure ships. He never even saw the storm. Only Le Griffin made it back home. Estimates are that between 1,000 and 1,500 people were killed in the disaster, putting it roughly on par with the sinking of the Titanic some 2 centuries later. Some survivors suggest that many of those people might have initially made it to shore only to be washed back out by the powerful surf. For the survivors, they were left exposed to the elements with few supplies. They were forced to use a salvaged lifeboat to seek help from the nearest Spanish settlement, St. Augustine, some 120 miles away. For the next 10 years, the Spanish braved the heat, the mosquitoes, attacked by pirates, and the constant threat of more storms in order to recover what they could of the lost treasure, eventually claiming that they'd recovered 80% of what was lost, although that might have been overstated in order to deter more treasure hunters. But then the location of the site was forgotten, lost, until archaeological discoveries in the 1950s. And in 1959, the discovery of an 18th century map that showed treasure hunters to what has been called Florida's Treasure Coast. Since then, millions of dollars of treasure from the 1715 treasure fleet has been recovered.
Hurricanes are, of course, still deadly today, but the loss of life at sea has been greatly reduced as systems of tracking storms have improved. But in 1715, there was no systematic collection of information about hurricanes.
Banding together in a fleet might protect you from pirates, but it can't protect you from the weather. Newton concludes that the risk inherent in it seemed to be accepted by policymakers, passengers, and seamen alike. The loss of the millions of man-hours required to build the ship, the millions of man-hours invested in the mining, smelting, minting, and transportation of the silver and treasure carried by the fleet, and the loss of more than 1,000 lives. That is merely, he says, part of the enormous cost of empire. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguyguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you have to do is subscribe.